Here inside the Sports Vision Spotlight packed studio today, Anthony Notarile, Damien Fiorello, Julian Coltre, all here to talk with Tony Luftman. Tony works at NHL.com as a digital host. He's also a host at CBS Sports Talk Radio, and we're here to dissect everything NHL, whether it be the trade deadline, the awards, the upcoming playoff race. We'll talk about it all with Tony. And Tony, first and foremost, how you doing today?
Doing great. Great to be with you guys.
And the thing we want to talk to you about, obviously, first, is the trade deadline. Big moves made there, a lot of moves made. I bet your job was probably hectic during that time. But of all those moves, what have you seen make the most immediate impact?
I mean, it's tough to measure because it is so soon after the trade deadline. I guess the biggest thing to me was that teams were really willing to make a push for it. My favorite move was the Keith Yandle move that the New York Rangers recognized, perhaps coming off of what they experienced last year, how hard it is to get to the Stanley Cup final, and the fact that they did last year and they returned back to 5 games. I really admire Glenn Sather and the Rangers for going all in because there's so much hype and excitement surrounding Anthony Duclair, but in order to get something, you got to give something up. Their power play was really pedestrian, and Yandle comes in with great credentials on the man advantage, so that to me was a great move in terms of recognizing a need and addressing it. Fans always want to trade, a friend of mine in the business calls it schlock. Fans want to trade players that aren't very good for players that are very good, and that's just not how it works because the guys on the other side of the deal, they know who's good and who isn't also. So to me, to get something, you got to give something up. Giving up Duclair hurts because he is going to be a star in this league. I really believe that. When you watched him at the juniors, you saw the kind of game that he possesses, and still recognizing the window because we are talking about windows here in the NHL. And what I recognize is that as Henrik Lundqvist gets older, the window for the Rangers perhaps closes. Cam Talbot had a great week last week and ended up being one of the NHL's 3 stars of the week, deservedly so, and he's done an admirable job. But I don't think he's the kind of goalie that can take you to a Stanley Cup. And we saw last year in the playoffs just how good Henrik Lundqvist could be, and we've seen it over the course of his career. He plays big in big games, and you really need a great goaltender. That's one thing that we've seen again and again over the course of history in the Stanley Cup playoffs.
Tony, Julian Coltre here. On the flip side, you sort of talk about it. What moves did you think that might have been made at the trade deadline but maybe didn't come out and then didn't happen?
Well, I mean, it remains to be seen. I'm hesitant to judge because I think one of the mistakes we make in sports is seeking instant gratification. It's one of the challenges. College basketball season's going on right now, and I just heard a great fact the other day. Mike Krzyzewski, who we've all heard of, 1,000 wins and gold medals in the Olympics and national championships. And he, in his first 3 years at Duke, did not have a good record. I don't know the numbers. And his athletic director was patient with him, and we all know what's happened. I think the biggest challenge is being patient. It's hard for a fan base to be patient. Certainly the Toronto Maple Leafs can attest to the challenge of patience, having not won a cup since 1967. I recognize the professionalism of the decision makers in hockey. I will say this, there's a lot of pressure at the highest levels. And in order to have one of those jobs where you're pulling the trigger and you're calling the shot, you've got to take chances. And I admire that. I think one of the saddest things about sports today is risk aversion. Anthony mentioned that I also host sports radio for CBS Sports. Last night I had Paul Westhead on, and we were talking about the fact that a lot of times coaches, teams, decision makers are more averting risk than they are seeking victory. So he told a story about having, in 1990, this Loyola Marymount team that went all the way to the Elite Eight. And what he said was when his players had 3 fouls in the first half, he kept playing them because they were his best players. And I read a book called Scorecasting, which touches on the same concept, which is risk and loss aversion. So back to the original question, I admire any of the teams that made bold moves. There were certainly some that were head scratchers, but the bottom line is you got to give it time. And I think realistically, these decision makers, whether it's managers, offices, ownership, they're making these decisions with good reasons in mind. So I'm hesitant to cast negative judgment. I will say, back to the Keith Yandle thing, that seemed like a good move on both ends, and that's why I felt comfortable talking about it.
Hey, Tony, this is Damien Fiorello here. I swear I'm the last person to introduce myself in this interview, but now I want to talk a little bit about the New York Islanders. They have been one of the best stories in the NHL this season. They just reached 90 points for them last night, which is almost a rarity. What has been the key to their amazing turnaround this season?
You know, a huge part of it was the acquisitions, and Garth Snow deserves credit for working all year round. Leddy and Boychuk really changed things for them. And it isn't just what they do on the ice, but their professionalism and their experience. I don't think you can discount the value of having Stanley Cup experience. Both those guys had it, and I think coming from the Blackhawks and coming from the Bruins, you're talking about cultures that are established, that are grounded in excellence. And I think those guys coming in really help. I think you give Jack Capuano credit, and I also think when you look at what John Tavares has done, it's just staggering. He's at the top of the league in points. He is such a spectacular talent. I think in this day and age, in the information age where we know about players so young, I mean, you think back to all the stuff we heard about Sidney Crosby. He was the next one, Sid the Kid and all that. Eichel now, Connor McDavid. We hear about these players coming up. So when a guy goes number one overall, you're pretty sure he's going to be a good player. John Tavares is a special, special player. Game-winning goals and clutch moments. And, you know, especially when, I got to be honest, when Kyle Opozo went down, I wondered how the team was going to deal. And certainly they handled it, and he's supposed to be back tonight, so I'm excited to see him play. I really enjoy watching them play. I love the history of hockey. I'm a huge fan of Stanley Cup history, and especially, when you go to Nassau Coliseum, which is a modest venue, and they're moving out of it, and we all understand why. But there's so much history when you walk around the corridors there to think that Ken Morrow and Mike Bossy and all the greats, Billy Smith, that's where all that great stuff happened. 4 straight cups. They established a record that I don't think will ever be touched. They won 19 straight series. That's an insane number. You had to win 4 series, obviously, to win the cup, and then their last year at the elite level, they lost in the Stanley Cup final to the Oilers. That's insane to be that good for that long. So it casts a long shadow, and we recognize that that's challenging to be a part of a franchise that has been to the heights. And frankly, you can watch the ESPN 30 for 30 Big Shot about how difficult things were when John Spano tried to buy the team and what a mess that was. But this franchise is in great hands now, headed in a great direction. And I also want to mention Yaroslav Halak. What a story. A few years ago when he was part of the Canadiens' run in the Stanley Cup playoffs, I thought, this guy's going to be a star. Well, things didn't quite work out that way. But this year, I'll say it again, this guy is a star. When you look at the wins he's had this season and the names he passed, Rick DiPietro obviously had that great year, Billy Smith, the kind of numbers these guys have put up, there was a time during the season where people said, are these guys for real? We are way past that threshold. We are way past that point. This team is for real, and all I want to see is how they perform in the pressure-packed playoffs, because it's a crucible. It's a whole different deal. We recognized that last year. The Boston Bruins won the President's Trophy, and yet there they are in the playoffs getting eliminated by the Montreal Canadiens. So being great in the regular season is one thing, but how do you perform and how do you deliver in the crucible that is the pressure-packed Stanley Cup playoffs? That's what I want to see from the Islanders.
Well, Tony, you mentioned goaltending for the New York Islanders. Now let's talk about goaltending for another New York team, the New York Rangers. Obviously, Cam Talbot making Ranger fans forget about the King Lundqvist when he went down. Talbot now 5-1-1, 2 shutouts in his last 7 games. Should the Rangers ride with Talbot even when Lundqvist returns? And do you think if they do ride with Talbot, would it make sense to maybe trade one of these assets for a large return?
I loved your emphatic no way, by the way.
No chance. No. This happens all the time, too, in hockey. This gets back to the instant gratification. You got to watch Henrik Lundqvist. I mean, This guy last year in the most pressure-packed games, in such incredibly difficult situations, they were down 3-1 to the Penguins. it was Mother's Day. We all remember the story with Marty St. Louis. To play well, I mean, it's a difficult position anyway. At a morning skate, anyone that's a hockey fan, just go there and watch what happens. With pucks flying at the net, that's hard. Then throwing the crowd. There's at NHL in one of the stairwells. There's a quote that says, "How would you enjoy?" Jacques Plante said this. How would you enjoy going to work at a job where every time you made a mistake, 15,000 people cheered and a red light went on? That's the nature of that position. So it isn't just the nuances of movement and reacting and pad saves and stick saves. And it's so much more than that. It's dealing with pressure. It's kind of fighting yourself because your natural inclination and your reactions are not to be trusted. To borrow from the book that I read by Ken Dryden, The Game, he's obviously one of the great goaltenders in Stanley Cup history. I just think that Cam Talbot has done a great job, but regular season hockey is very different from the Stanley Cup playoffs. And what we saw from Henrik Lundqvist last year, I don't think you'd ever demote him for being injured, particularly on a freakish play. I've watched that play probably 20 times because I love watching Lundqvist. It's insane. I mean, it's maybe the most unlucky play I've seen this year. It's just awful that, the puck's able to hit him in the neck in the most bizarre set of circumstances. So no to having Talbot play instead of Lundqvist. I do hope Lundqvist gets back and he's able to get into rhythm because I think that's a huge part of being ready for playoff hockey is having enough reps and being comfortable. There's rest versus rust. He's had plenty of rest, but you hope that he doesn't get rusty.
Here in the Sports Vision Spotlight, talking to Tony Luftman, NHL.com digital host and host at CBS Sports Talk Radio. Tony, let's talk Sidney Crosby for a second. He's been hot the last couple of games. He's still top 5 in points. He's still top 5 in assists. But you look at this season, and as good as he's been, right now he's on pace for about 82 points this year, which would be his lowest total in a season in which he hasn't missed any significant time due to injury. So what do you think's contributed to Crosby's sort of low numbers this year, and is it something Penguins fans should be worried about?
Not at all. I think, and to be fully honest here, I've been a Sidney Crosby fan for years. I've read the books. I've watched the documentaries. I am a fan of everyone in the NHL. Working for the league, you quickly recognize just how special every team is because you're covering them all. But Crosby is among my favorite players for several reasons. One is professionalism. Two, his dedication to the game. He does so much for the league. He says yes so often. But I think it's more than anything else, he is the most recognizable player, and yet it's still such a consummate pro in terms of taking care of his responsibilities within his team and then for the league. So I admire him and see him through that prism. That's number one. Number two, he has set such a ridiculously high standard. Last year, we all remember at the NHL Awards that he was gracious and magnanimous and very deserving of all the trophies he took home. We have been spoiled by watching him year after year put up ridiculous numbers and all the accomplishments and the Golden Goal and the Stanley Cup, youngest captain ever to win a Stanley Cup. That happened early in his career. And as you mentioned, the injuries, the concussions, this is a guy who is a spectacular player. Realistically, he's on a team that has excelled this year. Evgeny Malkin has had good numbers as well. They have so much talent, and there were moving parts the first year of the Johnston era. I'm not concerned with the numbers. I was talking about this last night on the radio show. We're in an era where we tend to overvalue numbers and statistics. And I think, big picture, certainly what you're saying makes sense. But big picture, I wouldn't be concerned with Crosby as long as he's healthy. Last year in the playoffs, he wasn't healthy. There was a wrist issue. As long as he's healthy, I think the Penguins and their fans have nothing to worry about. That's my only concern is he's such a competitor. Is he healthy? That would be the only concern I would have is based on the numbers being a little bit down, comparatively speaking, is he healthy? Now, I believe he's healthy, but realistically, it does jump off the page that if you're doing one of those line charts, it is a little bit of a slant down. But I'm not concerned about him. I admire him for the way he plays the game, the way he carries himself, and around the corridors of the NHL offices, there's a lot of appreciation for the kind of character that he has and the type of professional he is.
Now, Tony, back in the 70s, obviously all the drama surrounding the New York Yankees got him the nickname the Bronx Zoo. Today, I think an appropriate nickname for one of the NHL teams might be the Toronto Zoo because of everything that's going on with the Maple Leafs, though. Much like those Yankee teams in the 70s, the Maple Leafs aren't going to win a World Series like those teams with Reggie Jackson did. What's been the problem, if you can sum it up, obviously short because there's so much going on, with this Toronto team, and what do you think the long-term plan is for Brendan Shanahan to put that franchise in place?
Wow. That's, how much time do we have? It's sad. But more than anything else, it's just sad because you understand that Forbes puts out an annual evaluation of each NHL franchise. The most valuable franchise is the Toronto Maple Leafs. That puts into perspective the passion of that market, the interest, and the overwhelming importance of that organization. It's unfortunate that things have been so dysfunctional. I will say this. Getting rid of Carlisle clearly didn't fix things. Horacek has done his best. But I think the reality is you got to have better players and a better team. This isn't about scheme. It isn't about system. I think they need better players. It's very easy to criticize Phil Kessel, and it's very easy to criticize Dion Phaneuf, but I think it's deeper than that. The reason I love hockey more than any other sport is that it's a pure team sport. Shifts are 30, 45 seconds, and you're constantly sending guys on and taking them off. They need better depth. They need, and the challenge for Notice and Shanahan is to remake the roster. And no one wants to hear rebuild, particularly when you've missed the playoffs as much as the Leafs have. The most upsetting thing to me is fans taking off their sweaters and throwing them on the ice. I understand that there's tremendous passion. I touched on that earlier. But listen, nobody in the NHL goes out and tries to lose games. No one. And I get that you're passionate and it's frustrating and this is your team. And I just don't see that as, and now it clearly is a sign of great disappointment. And I get that. But I wish that didn't happen. So long story short, circuitous answer, they got to get better players. And I think in the offseason, Brendan Shanahan is a brilliant hockey mind. I have a lot of confidence with his experience in the league as a player and as an executive. I have a very strong suspicion they're going to get going in the right direction. I do want to say one more thing about Phil Kessel. Coming into this year, every year he's been there, he has led that team in scoring. And say what you will about Phil Kessel. I've heard negative things, a lot of negative things about his body language and about the way he plays the game. He's a scorer in a league that values scoring. I really believe, and at his cap number, I really believe there will be suitors. I think the Phaneuf deal at $7 million a year is probably tougher to move, but both of those guys, I think, have futures in the NHL, whether it's with Toronto or not. And it's hard to see the level of criticism that those guys have gotten. Granted, I understand that the stakes are high there, but it makes me uncomfortable, the amount of criticism that Toronto has gotten.
All right, Tony, speed round here. First name to pop in your head. Who's your Jack Adams Award winner?
Mike Babcock.
Hart Trophy
this is
for
not
MVP.
just about this year. This is about a body of work. It's staggering to me. It's disappointing that the best coach in hockey, when Canada wanted to win the gold medal, 2010, they're hosting the Olympics, which potentially could be like a once-in-a-generation thing. They decided to make Mike Babcock the coach. Then in 2014, they're going to Sochi. They do it again. Why? He's the best coach in hockey, and yet he's never won the Jack Adams. That's insane. So he's deserved to win it several times, probably last year more than any other year, because that team lost man games to injury from key players and still kept the streak alive. 23 straight seasons going to the playoffs for the Red Wings. And Babcock, in 12 seasons as a head coach, has taken his team to the playoffs every year. I admire what and I would feel totally comfortable with Barry Trotz winning it or Peter Laviolette. But Babcock, my goodness, overdue. The guy's got to win that award.
Tony, your Hart Trophy for MVP.
Oh boy. It's tough to pick between the two, and especially considering when we're doing this interview because of the struggles that the Preds have had. Pekka Rinne's stock has dropped and Carey Price's stock has gone up. I think both the Vezina and the MVP will go to Carey Price. We talked about the pressure in the market that is Toronto. Montreal's right there. I mean, 365 days a year. You talk about playing under banners and the kind of pressure that goes along with it. For Carey Price to do what he's done there is ridiculous. Earlier this year, he established a new record for consecutive road wins by a Montreal goalie. Here's the thing. Anytime you set a record that's a record for the Montreal Canadiens, that's huge, considering the history they've had, all the cups. So I think Carey Price, who's been really a magical level, when you go back to last year in Sochi, going forward from that, if you talk to Montreal people, they'll tell you if Chris Kreider doesn't collide with Carey Price, it's the Habs that go to the Stanley Cup final. It's a tough argument. We don't know. It's causal. But holy smokes, just watching that guy play is a pleasure. And I would not be surprised come Las Vegas at the award ceremony if Price wins both the Vezina and the MVP.
And finally, last speed round question, is the Calder Trophy Phil Forsberg's to lose?
Yes. Hoffman has come on strong and scored goals, but I think, and again, this is colored by what's happened to the Preds of late, the swoon, consecutive regulation losses. That streak is unnerving, but to look at what Philip Forsberg has done the entire body of work, the entire year, what he can do scoring in all three zones. He is a complete player, wise beyond his years, experienced despite his age. I am blown away by the effectiveness that he's shown. And I think when I think back to last year and the kind of year that McKinnon had in winning the Calder, I see Forsberg along the same lines, if not a little bit better, to be honest. Just a complete player and a really talented. I mean, when you watch him, the best part of my job at NHL is I'm able to watch every game. So I've seen him play, my goodness, so many games. And I'm always taken aback. I'm just thinking back to, I did a highlight the other night, and it didn't lead to a goal, but he weaved in and out of traffic and was able to handle the puck effectively. It's a very small sample size. It's one rush up the ice. But it reminded me of Sidney Crosby in that there's things that Crosby can do at full speed that a lot of guys would have trouble doing just standing still, puck handling, the stick mitts that players talk about, whether it's Patrick Kane or I marvel at the skill level of Forsberg, who's a younger guy. Pavel Datsyuk, all the names that we typically use, these are guys that are veterans that have been doing it a while. Forsberg has those kind of aha moments where you're like, whoa, this guy is super talented. So I think Philip Forsberg's the guy.
Tony, two more questions for you here on the Sports Vision Spotlight. First, it might be an easy one for you who's covered the whole NHL season. What two teams do you see in the Stanley Cup this year?
I would never pick against the Kings because, it all goes back to 2012 for me. They were the 8th seed, and they got into the playoffs, and they looked like world beaters, starting off each series up 3-0. From then to 2013, going to the Western Conference Finals banged up, and then 2014 winning the Cup last year, they're in a magical stretch of excellence that is just spectacular to watch. The pieces are all still there. They're still heavy. They're still physical. They're still skilled. Mm-hmm. They have all the pieces. And you can forgive them for not being as playing with as much urgency during the regular season as perhaps other teams might, because their years are long. They're playing into June and late May for 3 straight years, and now conceivably a 4th straight year. This run is really marvelous. I think we're going to look back at this and really be impressed with Jonathan Quick and the rest of those guys, what they've been able to do to be able to stay mentally and physically sharp to do all this. So coming out of the West, as unpopular a pick as it might be because they're still jostling to get into the field, and people might say, well, wait a second, what about Nashville or Chicago? Obviously, the injury to Kane is a heartbreaker. But coming out of the West, I still go Los Angeles. Coming out of the East, because of what Carey Price has done, we always hear if you've got good goaltending, you've got a chance. And considering where they were last year, they got to the Eastern Conference Final. I say the Habs. I think Carey Price is the best goalie in hockey. And what we've seen time and again over the course of history in the Stanley Cup playoffs, you've got to have good goaltending. Your goalie gets hot. I always think back to Jaguar and Anaheim. They lost the cup, and he still won the Conn Smythe. If you've got a great goaltender, and Carey Price is a great goaltender, you've got a real chance. So I think it'll be L.A. and Montreal in a flashback of the 93 Stanley Cup final, and I hope there's no curved stick this time around.
All right, so Kings, Canadiens, your Stanley Cup. Tony, last question. Less about the NHL season, more about your experience covering it. Of all the great moments this year, what's your personal favorite moment or memory from the 2014-15 NHL season?
There are two that come to mind right away.
All right, hit me.
And both of them have nothing to do with hockey on the ice, on the rink, in terms of action with pucks and sticks. One was the passing of Jean Beliveau and the way that he was honored, what he meant to Montreal and his wife. I did that highlight, and it was so hard because, these are our heroes. We heard the name Beliveau so many times, and he won the cup so many times. He was a man, in addition to being this extraordinary athlete. That was really hard because we are all mortal, even heroes, even these legendary gentlemen that, like Beliveau, played the game for years and years and made it special, that the players today are standing on the shoulders of giants. The love that people had for him was just so moving and so gripping. And the other, after the terrorist attack in Ottawa, the first game back there, the pregame ceremony, I mean, it's sports, and I love sports. I live for sports. But there are things that are bigger than sports. The way that all of Canada and all of hockey rallied around that place, that made me so proud because things were in their proper perspective. Instead of the teams lining up on opposing blue lines, they were all in a circle because it's one big family. And seeing the soldier when the anthem was being played, there was a soldier who was struggling to keep it together. And I think all of us, to varying degrees, were in that same place. It was a really, really moving, powerful moment. And I think it says a lot about hockey, the people that play hockey and the people that care about hockey. It's a special community. I hear all the time doing that radio show, people say hockey's a niche sport. Listen, everything is a niche sport. The NFL is massive. It's huge. Over 120 million people watch the Super Bowl. Every other sport compared to that has its niche. I'll tell you what, I'm very proud of our niche. I'm very proud of our family. I'm very proud of the way that hockey fans care about things within the game and beyond the game, like the passing of Beliveau, like that, the way that people reacted and responded with such care and concern after the terrorist attack.
Both very good choices, Tony. I can't disagree with you there. Once again, Tony Luftman, NHL CBS, here on the Sports Vision Spotlight. Anthony Notarile, Julian Coltre, Damien Fiorello. We had the honor and the pleasure to talk to you, Tony, and thanks a lot for the time and all the insight you gave us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.